All right, good morning. So my name is Bethany Bradley, and today my task is to do an overview for the rest of this meeting. So I'm going to be mentioning a lot of, briefly, I'm going to be mentioning a lot of things that speakers later on today are going to be talking about in a lot more detail. So I'm going to give you that overview of the implications of climate change for invasive species. And before I start, I should reveal that I mainly study invasive plants. So you're going to see kind of a skew towards terrestrial invasive plants within this talk. I hope that I've included a number of examples for other taxa and aquatic and marine systems as well, but know that other people know a lot more about aquatic, marine animals, especially, than I do. So, so if you like plants, that's what we're going to focus on primarily. So before we get started, I wanted to just sort of address the bigger question of why we really care about invasive species and what type of evidence we have that invasive species are really having negative impacts on native species and native ecosystems. I'm going to show a number of graphs that look sort of like this one throughout the talk. And this is from a meta-analysis that was just published last year on invasive aquatic species and the impacts of invasive aquatic species on the abundance of native species. And so I think I said this is from a meta-analysis. So what a meta-analysis is essentially any single study in science, right, gives us some insight into, what might be happening in terms of species interactions or how one species impacts the community or diversity or something like that. But it's really when we leverage all studies that have done something similar, have looked at the impacts of an invasive species on native abundance or native community, that's when we really can start saying, okay, this is a consistent trend, this is sort of our expected pattern or result when an invasive species comes into an ecosystem. So what a meta-analysis does is it measures this effect size, where basically you've got a negative, you can think of it as a negative impact or a positive impact. And so in all of these cases, you can see that when an invasive aquatic species comes into an ecosystem, so this is comparing where they're present from where they're absent, if an invasive aquatic species is present, you have a significant, so the bars don't overlap zero, significant negative impact on fish abundance, on zooplankton abundance, on macrophyte abundance, and then you have a suggestion of a negative impact also on benthic vertebrates and phytoplankton. So that's an example for invasive aquatic species. This is a similar example from another meta-analysis that was done a few years ago, looking at the impacts when an invasive terrestrial plant was either present or absent. So in the presence of invasive terrestrial plants, using all of these dozens of studies together, you see a negative effect, a negative impact on plant growth, plant abundance, plant diversity, plant fitness within the native community. You also see a significant negative effect on animal diversity and animal abundance, and the suggestion of negative impacts on a variety of other things that terrestrial animals are doing. So anytime you see these types of plots, especially when you have bars that don't cross the zero, those are really, really telling you about the overall pattern within the community. These are much more informative than any single study will ever be, because they give you this sense of the overall trends. So we know from these types of analyses that invasive species, aquatic, terrestrial, plants, animals, have strong and significant negative impacts on the native species and native communities. And that's why we're really concerned about, okay, if these things are moving, if invasive species ranges, if their abundance is changing with climate change, we know that's going to negatively affect our native communities in general. So what I want to talk about today, this is my outline of topics, are first about rising temperatures and earlier phenology and how that affects invasive species favorably relative to native communities. I'm going to talk about range shifts associated with climate change. I'm going to talk about how climate variability creates disturbance, which really facilitates a lot of invasion. I'm going to talk specifically about plant response to rising CO2, and I'll go through a couple of big challenges ahead of the unknowns Fortunately, I don't have any unknown unknowns on here since those are new. So starting with that first one, so rising temperature and earlier phenology. This is another meta-analysis. So this was a meta-analysis that was done comparing studies that looked at a paired, so basically paired studies of an invasive and a native under these altered climate conditions. So increased temperature, increased precipitation, or decreased precipitation. And so you can see that overall, the biggest effect that you're having associated with these is in aquatic systems. When you have a rise in temperature, anything above the line are places where the invader is going to be favored. So the one where you see the star is a significant effect towards the invader being favored when temperatures rise in aquatic systems. Now that's not so much because the invasive species are doing better when temperatures rise in aquatic systems. It's mainly because the natives do really poorly under those scenarios. So native species are generally not very able to adapt or respond to rising temperatures. It negatively affects their physiology very strongly, and that enables invasion of non-native invasive species. This is another very similar analysis that was done just this year. This one focuses only on invasive plants, and you can see sort of where this star is. Again, when you have increased temperature, that's favoring invasive plants, and these are terrestrial invasive plants relative to the native plants. So again, this may well be a similar signature where it's not so much that the invasive plants do better, but maybe that the native plants are doing comparatively worse. You can see that they're pretty close to the zero line. The other two, though, increase and decrease precipitation, and this was similar in the last study, those are a lot more uncertain, and at this point it doesn't necessarily look like changes in precipitation, positive or negative, are necessarily going to facilitate invasion. In fact, in this case, this is marginally significant difference. Decreased precipitation, so increased drought, and this is something that's coming up again and again in the western US and sort of our desert systems, that actually droughts may in fact facilitate the native communities because they reduce resources for invasive species that often require a lot of water resources. So earlier phenology. So why does earlier phenology affect invasion? So this is actually, so phenology is the repeating cycle of biological events. So basically, you know, when are birds laying eggs, when are flowers blooming, when are leaves bursting out of, you know, the trees and stuff like that. So if you go back year after year and measure those events, we're seeing these strong trends towards earlier phenology. So springs are getting earlier as time goes by. And this is just an example, sort of pictures from a cemetery in Lowell, Massachusetts, and this is the same date in 1868 compared to 2005, and you can see in 1868, right, no leaves on the trees. In 2005, lots of leaves on the trees. Now there's plenty of variability year to year, right? So some years spring is earlier, some years spring is later, but this type of long-term trends, this is a really nice study from 2006 and saw these significant long-term trends, even accounting for all of that kind of bouncing around year to year. So springs are definitely, you know, on the order of a week to 10 days earlier now than they were in the late 1800s. So how does that affect invasive species? Well, part of the effect on invasive species is what we call a priority effect in ecology. And priority effect, or the early bird catches the worm, or the early plant catches the sunlight is another way to put that. Priority effect says that if you're the first to arrive, then you've got a big advantage over your competitors because you can take advantage of all of those resources that nobody else is using at that time. So the water, the soil nutrients, the sun if you're a plant, you know, the worm if you're the bird and no other birds are around. And it turns out that invasive species are really good at greening up, especially if they're plants. Plants are good at greening up earlier in the season. So this is a picture of buckthorn, which is an invasive understory shrub. You can see that it's green early in the spring, well before the canopy leaves are coming out. So invasive species green up earlier. They have a priority effect because they're there and able to take advantage of those resources that the natives then struggle to compete against later on. And these are just some other examples of invasive understory plants in the Northeast, especially. All of these are Northeast understory invasives. So Japanese barberry, buckthorn, glossy buckthorn, and regular buckthorn, both a variety of different honeysuckle species that have been introduced across the Northeast, garlic mustard, all of those show this earlier spring green up and are presumably benefiting from that priority effect. Another thing that invasive plants appear to do really well is have this phenological plasticity. So what does that mean? It basically means that depending on the temperature, depending on the conditions of that spring growing season, you might green up earlier or green up later. So you're responding more directly to the climate. You're responding to those temperature conditions. This is in contrast to a lot of native species that are not as good at responding to those temperature conditions, that might be cueing in more to something like day length or other things that are less changing through time, whereas climate is shifting rapidly. So what that does is that it allows you to really take advantage of that priority effect that we talked about a minute before. And there was this really cool study from almost 10 years ago at this point, where they tested for this phenological plasticity and tried to figure out, what is causing species to persist through time and what might be causing species to decline through time. So what's really neat about this study, and this was done by scientists at Boston University in the early 2000s, was that they found this record from the late 1800s where this guy, Alfred Hosmer, who was an amateur botanist, spent a number of years cataloging the entire flora of the town of Concord in Massachusetts. And so he identified not only the species that were present, but also counted their relative abundance of these 429 flowering species, which is pretty awesome to have that kind of record going back so far in time. And then in the early 2000s, a group of Boston University scientists went out and recatalogued the entire flora of Concord, Massachusetts, looking for these same 429 species, as well as what new species might have come in. And this kind of crazy circular graph over here is the big results from their paper. And basically what this is this is a taxonomy, so it's kind of lumping and grouping similar species together. It's like a family tree kind of thing for plants. And the red bars over here, everything that you see in red on the bottom, are species that had a big decline in overall abundance. There are a few blue ones in there, and then a fair number of gray ones too. So blue were ones that actually increased in abundance, and gray were ones that didn't have any change in abundance space. There's a lot of red here, so we've lost a lot of abundance of these native flowering plant species. And so then they were like, well, why? What can best explain this loss of abundance relative, so what differentiates the group where the abundance was lost from the group where there wasn't a big change? And they found that the flowering species that did not respond to temperature decreased the most in abundance. So it was this phenological plasticity, the ability to track climate as climate was changing, that was enabling some species to persist. But if you weren't able to do that, those are the ones that were really declining. And they looked one step further at species that were invasive, so specifically species that were on noxious weed lists or within the grouping of invasive plants in Concord. And they found that those plants especially were really good and really able to shift their phenology earlier in time, so basically shift their growing season earlier, whereas native species were not. And it was just the invasive bits, non-native, non-invasive species were performing, basically doing the same as the native species. So those more plastic, the ones that are able to shift, which tend to be invasive species, are rapidly increasing in abundance. So a take-home point on this one is that invasives tend to be more responsive to warming temperature, whether they're aquatic or terrestrial, and that plastic response, that rapid response, is favoring their increased growth, favoring their ability to get resources early, and increasing their abundance over time to the detriment of native species. Okay, so point 2, climate change and range shifts. So why does that affect or facilitate potentially invasive species? First thing to remember here when we're talking about climate change is that climate change is happening really fast right now, relative to any time. So we're going back 650,000 years from the Antarctic ice cores here, and you can see that there is, some ups and downs, but if you look all the way to the right, that's current time, and you see those lines going straight up. And even if you zoomed in and zoomed in and zoomed in, you still see those lines for current going basically straight up, whereas nothing in the past goes, there's some fairly rapid changes relative to geologic time, but nothing like we're seeing today. And so if climate change is happening really fast, what does that favor in terms of species assemblages? It favors the species that can keep up, the ones that are moving the fastest to get into climate ranges that are best for them. So native species, how fast are native species moving? This is an example of a study from southern Vermont in the Green Mountains, initially done by the U.S. Forest Service, and then repeated, I think, by the Forest Service again. So in 1964, and then again in 2004, they went out to a set of fixed plots along a mountain gradient, elevational gradient, and measured tree composition. And they were particularly interested in sort of the line that separates, not always a super hard line, but the line that separates northern hardwoods, which are a little bit lower down, from the higher elevation boreal forests. And what they found over that 40-year period was that trees, northern hardwoods, had shifted up in elevation, as had boreal forests. So this line had kind of moved upwards. And that movement was about 600 feet. So 600 feet over 40 years is not a whole lot of feet, right? Granted, these are trees, so we have to give them a little leeway in terms of how far we really expect them to move. But 600 feet is not going to do it if you're thinking about how much the sort of velocity of climate is changing. Not very much. So in contrast, non-native species in particular, and a specific subset of native species are being moved around by us, by humans, really far, right? So they're not moving themselves, we're moving them. And this is a study from Europe, so this is actually a native species to Europe called Rox tauport. And the red here in kind of southern Europe shows the native range, or what we think of as the native range for this particular species. And then all of those green dots are nurseries across Europe that are selling this particular species. So presumably if a nursery is selling it, up in the Scandinavian countries, then that species is probably being planted in yards and gardens and stuff in areas surrounding those nurseries. And so this species that we've selected based on, the fact that we like its nice flowers or something like that, has this huge advantage because we've moved it really far north. And we should add to that the main pathway by which many invasive species are introduced, so invasive fish, invasive plants, most invasive animals, is deliberate through either stocking of fish, aquarium pets, the pet trade, the ornamental plant trade are the main pathways by which these species actually get introduced. So if we're thinking, okay, we know that, for example, the ornamental plant trade is allowing species to move further north, and we know that most invasive plants got introduced through the ornamental pathways, we can draw that line pretty clearly that most of these invasive plants are already being given a pretty huge advantage by people moving these species around. So I should also add to this that there have been some really nice studies done on invasive pests, so forest pests, for example, and pathogens, and the main pathway that those come in is on international trade of ornamental plants. So there are sort of bugs on the plants, or there's a pathogen on those plants. And so as we're moving plants, we are also moving pests and pathogens. So as biologists, as ecologists, we tend to often think about dispersal as wind dispersed or seed dispersed, or floats down the river and makes it a few feet further and sets seed and stuff like that. But really, for invasive species, this is what we should be thinking about, right? It's it's bamboo being planted in a variety of different yards, the latest and greatest kind of nursery crop that's potentially invasive or that we know is already invasive. It's failure to clean our boats that introduces aquatic invasive plants, zebra mussels, those types of invasive species. I should also note to this that there's a talk later today by Britta Teller on some of her research looking at increasing invasive plant dispersal with warming temperatures. And so this is people are probably the main mechanism of dispersing species, but there's a little bit more to this story, which is that warming temperatures also increase the ability of invasive plants, or this particular invasive plant, to disperse too. The other thing that warming does for forest pests and for pathogens as well is that warming favors this greater quantity and variety of forest pests. So as you go into warmer environments, you see a lot more bugs, you see a lot more insects, a lot more problems to forest species, native forests, as well as to crops. And this is just an example of a winter moth caterpillar, which is problematic in eastern Massachusetts, something that Joe Elkington's going to mention a little bit tomorrow. So why is this? It's because most of these pests are ectotherms, that is, they're not producing their own heat, they're relying on the environment to provide that heat. And so if you warm up the environment, that means a couple of things. It means that the physiology of the individual insect is better, more able to reproduce, living longer, healthier, eating more leaves, whatever it is. But it also means that you have the potential for multiple life cycles of those species. So if your season extends earlier into the spring, later into the fall, then rather than having a single, population of a bark beetle, for example, you could have multiple populations of that bark beetle. And this mountain pine beetle is a really good example of that. So some of the concerns about these massive outbreaks in the western U.S. of mountain pine beetle have to do with that, increasing number of life cycles, increasing numbers of juvenile mountain pine beetles that are really decimating our forests. And this is a monstrous problem out west, and especially if you couple it with things like forest fire, got a lot of standing dead biomass that's going to be easy to burn. Range expansion, so there are a few species that we can be pretty confident in where we know that their physiology doesn't tolerate really cold temperatures. So this is an example for emerald ash borer. So right now, most of the eastern U.S. is in the crosshairs for emerald ash borer, but there are some areas, in the northern Midwest, in Minnesota and North Dakota, where there is less ability for the emerald ash borer to persist because it's just too cold there right now. But if the temperatures warm a little bit, particularly winter temperatures warming a little bit, then you can potentially have expansion of that species further into the upper Midwest, into Canada, where it can cause more trouble for ash trees. This is another example of an invasive plant that could expand with warming temperatures. So this is kudzu, the vine that ate the South. This is the bottom left picture is sort of the edge of a forest. And the middle one is a car that was parked, last Tuesday or something like that. And this over here on the bottom right is actually a house outline. If you look carefully, you can see the people screaming inside, I think. So this is a model that was done several years ago of kudzu expansion. So with too cold of a temperature, the kudzu sort of root mass cannot survive under really cold conditions, and so it can't form long-standing or expanding populations further north. But as you warm those winter temperatures, you see an expansion. So the red on here, red area are areas that have high probability of kudzu persistence in population by 2100. So we're looking at 80 years at this point. And all the hash marks on there, when you'll see, you know, where we are in Western Massachusetts is right here in the middle of the hash marks. Those are all expansions relative to current, you know, potential. And we know in Massachusetts there are a number of really small right now, but populations of kudzu that are in people's yards or that, you know, people are cultivating over time. So that's a big concern for Northeast forests if we can't manage to eradicate those early infestations of this species. It could turn into, you know, something like this, what the Southeast is currently experiencing. For New England, another cause for concern, and this is another study that was led by Jennick Allen, who we'll talk later today, on the Northeast as a hotspot for plant invasion. So what she did was she took all invasive plants. So we had a group of almost 900 invasive plants that have been declared someplace in the US as either invasive or a noxious weed by the state or federal USDA, and modeled all of those relative to current and future climate. And so this is all of those species stacked together, looking at these kind of hot spots of lots of different invasive species, and how those hot spots might shift over time. So the biggest hotspot right now for diversity of invasive plants is the Southeast US, but with warming temperature, the Northeast and New England starts to become much more in the crosshairs for this diversity of different invasive plant species potentially forming problematic populations up here. And so one thing we've been doing and are continuing to do and will continue to do over the next couple of years is to try to think about, okay, we've got this set of, you know, dozens of invasive plant species, is sort of a list of ones that are not currently in the Northeast, or, you know, pick your state or jurisdiction, not currently here, but potentially could be here under climate warming by mid-century. So we're talking about the next 30 years, something like that. But all of those species aren't equal, right? So some of them have the potential to have much higher impacts than others do. And so what we've been doing is something that's been, this assessment that's been created for international scale, actually, called an invasive species impact assessment, which basically involves reading all of the scientific literature on impact studies for that specific species and scoring them on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 low and 4 high, relative to different impact mechanisms, like how does that species compete or outcompete native species? You know, does it have a chemical impact, like it's an allelopath and, you know, releases chemicals into the soil that can kill or reduce the growth of other plants, those types of things. So we hope that eventually, by coupling an impacts assessment with these range shifts, that we'll be able to produce much better forecasting and risk assessments of what are the species that we should really be prioritizing from a management perspective, because not only are they shifting in, but they're likely to also cause a big impact when they get here. So the take-home point on range shifts is that all species ranges are shifting, or should be shifting probably with climate change, but the invasive species, especially the invasive species that we're already cultivating, have already released, or, you know, we might have done, you know, 40 years ago, like Oriental bittersweet, and learned, but now it's all over the place. Those species have this enormous advantage relative to climate change because they're already there. They've already been introduced into these ranges that are getting warmer, you know, changing precipitation and stuff like that. So they're going to be the first that are able to take advantage of those changing temperatures, changing climate. Third piece in here is the theme of disturbance. So we know two things. We know that climate change itself increases variability, increases the kind of highs and the lows of temperature, the highs and the lows of precipitation. This is just a picture of the massive drought that happened in 2012 across, pretty much the entire U.S. Actually, not so much in the Northeast, but so if you were here, you might not have noticed, but everywhere else in the U.S., this massive drought. So these big shifts from super drought to super wet, of the sort like we saw in California over the last couple of years, massive drought to a super wet year this last year, that kind of variability is in and of itself a form of disturbance. We also know that invasive species do really, really well under disturbed environments. This has been shown time and time again. That, going back, so this is kind of a classic now paper from 2000 by Davis et al., where they looked at, so as you increase disturbance and as you increase resources, which are also become more available with a disturbed environment, because, so for example, if you disturb something and you remove the species, there's more soil nutrient there now because nobody's using it, that type of thing. Then you see this gradient of invader abundance. So disturbance increases invader abundance. This is another example for garlic mustard in Northeast forests, where as you increase disturbance, you see this increase in the overall density of plants. If you add disturbance as well as propagule pressure, so basically the seed availability of that species, then you have this huge increase in the overall abundance of those invasive species. Conversely, native species don't do particularly well under these stressed environments and disturbance environments. And this is an example that was a review of studies on forest health, so basically mortality of forest tree species. I think it was global, but this is just an image from North America. In the eastern US, there are not as many studies that were done as in the western US, but in the east, they saw that mortality of oak species and hickory species in particular were tied to these severe, these kind of extreme winter temperatures and hot summers. So those climate changes, that variability in climate starts stressing native ecosystems, whereas native or invasive species kind of like it. Native tree mortality, right, increasing with extreme events. This is just an example of a picture of disturbance following Hurricane Katrina. Tree canopy cover, of course, following Katrina drops significantly. And what they saw then is immediately following that, you had this big flush of understory species, right, responding to this availability of sunlight, more soil resources, more availability of water, those types of resources that the trees were previously using, which under normal circumstances is fine, right, because that's kind of like part of normal forest succession. But in this case, the majority of those understory plant species that were the first out of the gates kind of thing were invasive plants. So we don't know, the jury is still kind of out on this, whether kind of a normal forest successional process will take place or whether those invasive species could potentially alter forest succession. But it's definitely concerning that this understory, flush of understory species that we're seeing is primarily invasive. So the take-home point on that is that climate variability, extreme events like Hurricane Sandy are creating novel disturbances across the US, and that those novel disturbances likely favor invasive species and also likely do the opposite, harm native species. So last major point is the interaction between plants and rising CO2. So this is a graph from the Mauna Loa Observatory where they've been measuring atmospheric CO2 since the late 1950s. The Keeling curve, right, going up through time. You can see these sort of squiggles in here are basically caused by the northern hemisphere, where most of our plants that use CO2 are in the northern hemisphere. Most of the southern hemisphere is ocean. So basically every time you see it go down, those are the northern springs and early summers of basically the entire northern hemisphere inhaling all of that CO2, the plants inhaling, not us inhaling. And then when it goes up again, those are the northern falls and winters when we're stopped, those plants are no longer consuming the CO2. So you probably remember from high school biology, right? What does a plant use for photosynthesis? It needs carbon dioxide, it needs water, it needs sunlight for photosynthesis, and then it's releasing oxygen, right? So generally, if you're a plant, adding CO2 helps your physiology. It's a good thing. And in fact, we've seen, this is actually sort of on the ExxonMobil website of, what happens when you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, your trees grow larger. This is true. On average, you see increased growth across your trees and crops and shrubs. You see more, kind of better physiology amongst flowering plants and fruiting plants. All of that is definitely true. The question, though, is who is benefiting the most? Who is benefiting the most from this rising CO2? And what we see from plants is that the terrestrial invasive plants, so that's here in the red in this top bar that's highlighted, are significantly more positively impacted by rising CO2 than the native ones, this top one in the blue. So you can see this positive effect on the natives, but a more positive and significantly more positive effect on our invasive species. So we might be favoring our native species with CO2, but they're going to be overgrown by all of these weedy species that are favored even more than the native species. The other big problem with weeds and rising CO2 is that they start to become even harder to kill. So this is an example for Canada thistle that RISCC is going to talk about, I think, a little bit more, and this whole theme he'll talk about a little bit more later. Under ambient CO2, you get a few plants. Under higher CO2, you get way more plants earlier. And so two things, both it takes a lot more energy, weed killer, whatever it is, to kill these species, and also these ones are more resistant to our current, Roundup kind of weed killers than the ambient CO2. So a lot more work if we want to use chemicals, a lot more chemicals, or the need for different, harsher chemicals to kill our weeds. Other invasive species in CO2, so definitely the plant story is pretty well known. There is also some suggestion that it's not just terrestrial, that it may also be aquatic plants that have this larger advantage under increased CO2. So again, positive effect up here. The non-native is the gray, the native is the black. The other thing that might be going on is that under rising CO2 in aquatic and marine systems, the native animals in particular are doing much worse. So they're not able to adapt well to more acidic oceans, for example, or higher CO2 within aquatic freshwater systems. And so that also is likely to favor the non-native invasive species. Another example of a native winner with rising CO2, so this is not an invasive species, although a lot of us would consider it kind of a weedy species that we don't particularly like. This is poison ivy. So higher CO2 conditions make poison ivy grow faster. They also make it become more allergenic. This was kind of a fascinating study that was done down at the Duke free air CO2 exchange site. So they were looking primarily at sort of forest growth and how that's affected by rising CO2. And they started noticing that they were getting a little itchy or something like that, and that there was a lot more poison ivy out there. So they did the kind of intelligent thing that well-rounded scientists would do, and they sent a graduate student out to survey all of the poison ivy and test And she found that indeed it does grow faster and is more allergenic. So that's something to look forward to. So take home point on this one is that all plants on average do better under higher CO2 conditions, but the relative growth of those species really does matter, and it's going to affect what our flora look like under future climate. And those invasives in particular are doing much better. They're becoming harder to kill, and potentially more allergenic. So not good news overall if you're concerned about invasive species and CO2. So the last point that I just wanted to make was to go through some of these known unknowns. So basically, where does our uncertainty lie when we're talking about invasive species and CO2? And so this is an example of a study that was reviewing invasive species and climate change in the Northeast. And the point that I want to make here is just that there are a lot of arrows on this graph, right? So climate is not only affecting forests directly, but it's also affecting forests indirectly through pests, through invasive plant competitors, which are then affecting forest health. It's affecting it indirectly by changes in sort of ecosystem function, like the rates of fire, the way that the nutrients and carbon get stored in the soils. All of those things are interacting, and that makes it more challenging to predict exactly what's going to happen along, to our forests generally. And that's not just in terrestrial systems. So this is another paper that was reviewing invasive species and climate change for aquatic systems. And again, just making the point that there are a lot of arrows here, right? There's a lot of things that we need to consider if we're thinking about the ecosystem as a whole. So what I've talked about today are kind of general trends, but if we really want to dig into the specificity of a specific system or a specific area that we're working on, that's going to require a lot more work. Another known unknown is this question of what's coming next, right? So we are constantly bringing in new species from abroad, so that includes new pets, new animals, new plants, new trade partners that we're trading with. And we know that over time, as we trade more and more with people, the incidence of non-native and potentially invasive species being introduced continues to rise. But the biggest place where invasive species rise is early on with new trading partners. So basically, we get this kind of leveling off of that curve. If we continue to trade with Canada, for example, who we've been trading with for centuries, we might get that same species introduced again and again and again, and eventually maybe it'll become established and potentially invasive. But if we're just starting to trade with, a country that we haven't traded with much before, and we're bringing in new ornamental plants from there, bringing in new pets and animals from there, that's where we start getting these really novel species and have this big increase in susceptibility and an array of potentially invasive species. And this was a study from a couple of years ago where we're just trying to highlight where those countries are. This is specific to nursery plant imports, so live plants for planting. And basically, the blue areas on here are ones that are already established sources, so continuing to trade with them might add a few more species, but the ones that we're really concerned about are the ones in red and kind of pink colors on here. Those are the ones that are emerging that we've kind of recently started trading with over the last couple of decades, where novel species coming from those places are the most likely to introduce something totally new to the US ecosystems that could potentially become the next generation or the next wave of invasive plants. I mentioned this earlier, but it's not just invasive plants that we're worried about in terms of those novel plant species coming in. It's also forest pests, as well as other plant pests and pathogens. The live plants, so that's shown in green here, live plants are the main pathway that sap suckers, leaf eaters, pathogens come in to the US. They're riding on those plants. The only one that's slightly different are wood boring beetles and stuff like that. So wood feeders, which come in, not surprisingly, primarily on wood, including in wood pallets and wood packaging material of other goods. And we also know that if, these are some examples of USDA intercepts of these various different species in shipments of nursery plants in the early 2000s. We're talking about tens of thousands of insects, mites, diseases, mollusks being intercepted on these plants. So this is a main mechanism that we're currently and continuing to introduce invasive species. So thanks so much for listening. I just want to go quickly through and reiterate those main points from today. First one was that invasive species respond strongly to warming temperatures because that favors their early growth, and early growth and that priority effect tends to increase the abundance of invasive species relative to native species. We know, second, that species ranges are shifting, but that invasive species, and particularly any species that we've planted or transported or brought outside of its native range, is going to have the biggest head start as climate warms. Third thing, we know that climate variability, so these swings from drought to flood, hot to low kind of thing, creates novel disturbance that our native ecosystems have not really experienced, for a really long time in their evolutionary history, and that disturbance favors invasive species, which are really have these kind of traits that enable them to take advantage of the availability of a lot of resources, growing fast, sucking up all of those soil nutrients, light, what have you. And then last thing, we know that invasive plants have this growth advantage with higher atmospheric CO2 that's relative to native plants. All plants are doing better, invasive plants are doing even better. And so that means that we're going to have even more of a weedy problem in our crop systems, in our forests, in our native ecosystems than we've had in the past. So thanks so much for listening. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.